about?
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Yeah.
You look remarkably fresh.
If I don't last the whole time, you'll forgive me. I ask you in advance. Yeah.
So do you want me to begin it, or do you
You
want to
begin.
talk first if
No,
you're
no,
while you're awake?
You
Or?
begin. No, you begin, and I'll respond. Because
Okay.
I've got to-
All right. So what the first thing that had come up is when we want the papers probably a week after the final class, and then everybody send that a copy both to each of us, and then we will coordinate how we want to deal with that. Is that okay? So let me first just indicate how much I personally have valued your papers. I think that they are appropriately responsive to the readings, both in terms of agreement, disagreement, the similarities between our writings, the convergence and the divergence. I think people are picking those issues up, the difference of tone, the difference of voice, the difference of emphasis. And of course, as you attend to that, you are beginning to develop your own theological language, your own theological style, like what is working. And I think everybody, a number of people have actually put forward their own personal hopes for this kind of a course as they want to develop, and I encourage that very much. I also want to say that I'm personally grateful for the pushback on some of the things that I've been writing. It's still in process, and some things are clearer than others, or will become clearer thanks to seeing your face and how you're responding. So please continue to be honest and direct, and we'll go forward. So what I
second all of that. That's
yeah,
good.
okay. And I think that what's happening is I think a number of you have really shown that you want to grow theologically, and you're using this as a chance to see what is resonating, what isn't resonating, and the chance to kind of clarify your position or your orientation around the way each of us has formulated. Don't forget, this for us is a lifetime project, but it's not the first time around, and it's also attempts both to deal with theology in a very personal way, but we've also had a slightly different journey than you, both in the sense biographically, obviously, both in terms of our roots and the challenges that we have gone through and the people who've influenced us. And then the other aspect, of course, is that both Art and myself have made a long journey through academic life. That is to say, there is a very deep and rich stratification of involvement in the sources and how one retrieves that material. I want to come back to that because both of us have dealt with the mythic and the mythopaic, and I'm just going to throw out from the very beginning, part of this issue is what Ricoeur talks about as second naivete, of how one begins to retrieve mythic or materials that one would not easily have appropriated, that's a Ricoeurian term, at the naive or fundamental level, but nevertheless there's deep wisdom in the tradition, and we have to develop a way of retrieving its truth, even though that truth has gone through multiple new filters. That's what he calls the second naivete, where one tries to recapture mythic or symbolic imagery, or even the straightforward nature of the narrative text of the Torah, and how that is going to work. Okay, so there's a deep process of an inner ritual, of an inner. I talked about liturgy, but Art and I have spent a lot of time trying to find a new vocabulary. Art said very clearly in both of his opening papers the need to find a new religious vocabulary, a new theological vocabulary, which can't skirt anything in the tradition, even if it's a pushback, and it can't skirt the powerful forms of myth-making, even if we have to kind of reformulate that in new terms. I want to, I want to make three points to begin with as we come back to my material. It will slightly allude to Art's, but I want Art to speak to his material and his relationship to mine on his own. But I just want to say this just to get our heads back into the discussion. So, as you can see, my way of trying to do this round of theological thinking is to work through the various strata of the history of interpretation, on the assumption that each one of these layers conditions or allows us to experience the world or the tradition in a different way and in a different vocabulary. So last time we saw that the whole range of pshat, as I chose to articulate it, was our first entry into the natural world. All the things that we see and that we feel, that we do so as persons in the world. Obviously, we're already shaped by a prior Jewish language, and that's why the pshat examples are reading the Torah text at a kind of straightforward level of how does that affect my experience of the world, my attention to the world, my response, the way I make decisions. And I'm using examples from that because I don't come into the world tabula rasa. I'm already have an oral tradition before I have a written tradition. My oral tradition is what I get from parents, from school, and also from the Torah. And that's already a first order experience of the world that I then have to kind of work with. That is also, you want a piece of paper? Okay. So that is a personal voice that's already shaped by a tradition that we pick up with our mother's milk, as it were. And it's something that we always have. So, the sages say, Ein mikra yotzei midei pshuto. You may go through all kinds of interpretations, but Scripture never loses the pshat level. So we never lose this first order of theological experience. When you wake up, when you see, when you touch, when you smell, when you're making decisions, that's never lost. But when we move to the level of drash, there's another order of consciousness, of religious consciousness, theological consciousness, and another way of using our tradition. And that is, we shift from just being a person or in a family or just the first order language to a second order, and that is the language of community. It's the language of historical tradition. It's the language of being the heirs of 2,000 years of interpretation, in terms of 2,000 years of imagination, Midrash Agadah, 2,000 years of struggling with practice and halacha, Midrash Halacha. And all of that puts us into a we voice. We speak a we voice, not just an I voice, but we never lose the I voice. We begin to speak a we voice. We begin to insert our life, as I mentioned, everything is liturgical. The way I see the world and respond to the world is liturgical. Even my halachic life is liturgical. That is to say, it's not simply at the natural level. It is a level that's second order experience onto the natural level, and precisely because of the natural level, there's going to be a tension between my first order experience and my religious experience. And hopefully that's a productive one, and it's ongoing and changing. So that is the way that we move into a communal commitment, communal sense of memory, communal sense of the future, and the way the history of rabbinic language shapes theological consciousness. I'll come back to this, but I want you to pick up. But it's based on Torah and Scripture as a founding authority, but already through the history of rabbinic interpretation that's trying to create collective images or images that are passed down for liturgical expression. I think that the study of the text is an avoda. So it's an avoda of the imagination as well. It's not just an avoda of work, right?
Next phrase, an avoda of the imagination. That's one.
Yeah.
That's one to put in the back of your mind somewhere.
Yeah.
Along with growing theologically.
Yes.
Avoda of the imagination.
So now let me add two.
Fishpan phrases to tuck away.
All right. So now let me add two more things. So fundamentally, it's the role of midrash. That is to say, midrash in the double sense. It's an inquiry into the text, and it's a seeking of God through the text. It's a doresh, a drisha, right? So keep all of that in mind. The third is that if one is thinking midrashically, as is clear from both of our writings, one is thinking poetically or paically. One is, that is to say, living within images and thinking through images. Now, one of the issues that I was trying to face, and I want Art directly to deal with this, and I'll tell you why. He begins his wonderful piece about crossing of the sea by saying we have to develop a mythic language or a new theological language. He says that again at the beginning of Keter. But if you read the text carefully, then he also says that both texts are dealing with historical myth. And he says in the first essay, you have to do that personal work yourself. But the examples of doing that personal work we're going to hear orally, but it's not in those two pieces. What I've tried to do, at least here, is to give you living examples of what it means to think theologically through myth. How, for example, I begin with that marvelous text from Bereshit Rabbah about balancing the hot and the cold and the whole emergence of an ulai consciousness. Is it going to stand? Ulai ya'amod. And you notice that that issue of balance and tension, whether it's din and rachamim, or it's law and love, or it's limit and expansion, or it's with Avraham where you have this issue that you're committed, let us say, to tefillah, and then you have haknasat orchim. How do you choose between these tensions and what is the appropriate balance? I introduced that as well through the halachic example of peyah, where you have shi'ur and things that don't have a shi'ur. How do you balance limit and non-limit? And these kinds of issues. So in all of these cases, whether it was the case of the ulai aspect of that creation is a balance, so it becomes a paradigm for everything in some ways, but also the issue of standing under tachtit hahar. So thinking our way mythopoeically into that imagery, but you notice, if you paid attention carefully, you saw that there are two images that Chazal use. One is being under the weight of the law, which is a limit. The other image is that it's a protective image, right? Of the Yonah b'chagvei asela. That protecting the law is also a protection. It's a caring. Now, obviously, those tensions have to be balanced. And we're going to all do that slightly differently. Let me add one more thing, and then I want your responses and Art's response. Let me come back to the issue of recur and second-order naivete. For me, it's very, very important. At the end of his book on the symbolism of evil, he uses the phrase, the symbol gives rise to thought. I think what he's also adapting is the very end of Ernst Cassir's second volume of Symbolic Forms on myth, where he's talking about the move from myth to rationality or science. What is this move from symbol gives rise to thought? Well, what Ricoeur wants to indicate, and the way he tries to deal with evil, is that when we first encounter the world, we have a direct emotional, affective relationship to it, and that elicits images, right? Those images are interactive and personally dynamic. It's only after a certain period of time that you can step back, formulate them, and they give rise to conceptual thinking. But the first order, particularly when he's talking about evil, it's this contact with miasma, that's kind of the poison that affects existence, the sense of guilt, which is not yet formulated in terms of clear conceptual categories. The power, for me, in using the mythic imagery, and we'll see it'll happen again with Remers and Sode, and I'm sure for Art, and he'll explain it in his way, is to begin a new process of theological thinking in which you allow those images to resonate deeply as a series of unfolding images that the sages are articulating, and to feel their new theological resonance for us in the modern time. In other words, it's not simply taking the midrash and then giving it a new philosophical or allegorical reading. That would just be to play the same game that the Maharal does or anybody else does. In other words, it's this, but it really means this. That is not going to be our approach. The approach is to enter into the images in their own emotional and imagistic unfolding, and allow that to affect our thinking about certain topics through the prism of traditional midrash. I believe that's not an easy task, but I believe that part of that is this retrieval of midrash and mythic thinking for ourselves. It also means, and I think this is where we become very essential and why sometimes reading these theologies is difficult, is that you're reading slightly atomistically. Each image stands on its own. So it's for the theologian to collect the images and put them together in a sequence. I put them together in my sequence. Art puts them together in his sequence. But there's no overarching philosophical conceptual order that then gives this kind of streamlined, systematic. Jewish theology is verse-centered. And I would even say one final thing, and then I'll stop. It occurred to me many years ago in teaching Midrash and teaching some of the difficult anthropomorphic and anthropomorphic passages. And there's a book that was written by a very famous rhetorician from England, Owen Barfield. And he wrote a number of books about rhetoric. But he used a phrase that's a Platonic phrase, where Plato says, how do you save the myth? My concern is saving Scripture. And how does the Midrash save Scripture from itself? It doesn't read the verse as the Pshat does. It saves Scripture by reading words. It breaks it down into small images, and that those images then combine with other images and create a prism. And lo and behold, Chazal have given us a theology that saves Scripture by never actually reading the sentences. Or even if you go through and you're reading sequences of sentences, you're able to linger in an image. That puts a particular burden on theology, because it means what gives coherence to our theological life. Part of it that it's answered, of course, is the rhythm of the year when you're studying and reading. the rhythm of prayer when you're interpreting and reciting, and the rhythm of halacha over the course of a day and a year. That's giving that kind of inner structure. So let me stop with those kinds of reflections, and maybe Art will pick up, and then everybody to jump in either in response to what I'm saying or in response to the material that you read. Okay. Was any technical word that I used or anything that you want to add? It was more or less clear. Oh, good. Okay.
Okay. Many things to say. Most of them related to what you've had to say and to a topic today, but I can't resist beginning coming off the plane from Israel. Many wonderful conversations with people in Jerusalem. I really go there to talk to people because there are more people to talk to in Greater Yerushalayim than in the rest of the world combined. I'm thinking about a conversation yesterday with my friend Elchanan Nir. Elchanan Nir is a Rosh Yeshiva in a place called Siach Yitzchak in Efrat. He's also the editor of the Musaf Shabbat of the newspaper Makor Rishon, which is a kind of settler-oriented newspaper, but the Musaf Shabbat is probably one of the best literary fora in Israel, especially for dealing with questions of religion. He does wonderful stuff. He's a poet. And he said to me in this conversation, so this idea you have that Judaism has something to say about universal themes, and is not just addressed to the Jewish people, that Judaism has something to say to the world, where do you get this from? Do you get this from Psukim, or do you get this from Mishnayot? You get this from Scripture, do you get this from the rabbis? And you reminded me of that conversation again this morning, because the phrase Derech Eretz Kadmala Torah sort of is the starting place. There is a Derech Eretz, there is a kind of universal morality that we assume, and we read Torah through that lens. As you say, the education we receive, the essential values we have, and there are people who are ready to jump on us and scream, those are Western values, and you have no right to read the Torah through Western values. You have to read the Torah only through its eyes, and your contemporary values are blind you to what the Torah really wants to say to you. And that's not who we are, I think. We accept that Derech Eretz, and that Derech Eretz, as far as I'm concerned, is not just the creation of our modern democratic Western values, but is the prism of our sort of ground belief in the presence of God throughout reality, and in every human being Tzelem Elohim, and finding the Tzelem Elohim in human beings and in all of creation. And I say that because it's been a very hard 2 weeks to be in Israel with what's going on with both the African refugees and the seeming indifference of people to the loss of life in Gaza. It's been a very hard time, and I think I am struggling with that and feeling the ever greater urgency of our collective project of shall I call it a religious humanism in Judaism through a religious humanistic lens, which does use the tradition to affirm the kinds of human values we believe in and the kinds of universalism we believe in, and that sense that we are struggling for the soul of this tradition is ever stronger coming back from Israel. So I just needed to sort of begin there. The midrashic process is so essential to what keeps Judaism alive. The fact that you preserve the text through the wide-ranging ability to reinterpret, and that midrash becomes the lifeblood of Judaism, because it allows for creativity, it allows for creative expansion of the tradition, while at the same time preserving the text, preserving quote unquote, keeping the words of the text are there, but as you say so well, yes, we take a word from here and you tie it to a pasuk from Iyov, and tie that back to Bereshit, and tie that to something from Tehillim, and so on, and you can do almost whatever you want with it. But the text is there, and you get to love the text partly because you see how elastic it is and how much you can do with it, and that only confirms your love for the text. That only confirms our attachment to the text. Midrashic freedom confirms our attachment to the text. I recommend to you an article that had a very great effect on me. Somebody who sort of became an accidental culture hero of my Jewish education, and that's an article by the late philosopher Shimon Ravidovich called On Interpretation.
Right.
On Interpretation. You can find it in his collected essays. Ravidovich was a great professor of Jewish thought at Brandeis. He died just as I came to Brandeis as undergraduate, so I never knew him, but his influence was very much felt in our department. And he talks there about the freedom to reinterpret as being the great literary gift of Judaism. It goes along with that essay, Ravidovich on Interpretation, goes along with Bialik's wonderful essay, Gilui v'Kisui Balashon, Revelation and Concealment in Language, which is also an absolute must for your Jewish education. And
That's been retranslated and came out, I think, this small little IBIS paperback. Maybe I'll bring it in the next time so you'll see it.
It's a wonderful,
it's a very
wonderful essay.
a very excellent new translation.
And yes, because it was a hard thing to translate. And Ravidovich says there that in some ways the freedom of Midrash, the freedom to reinterpret and to preserve the text through that creative reinterpretation, died with Spinoza. Because Spinoza came along, and Spinoza, the harbinger of modernity, says, no, the text is what the text says. You can't simply read into the text. You have to treat the scripture text like you treat any other text, treat it at face value. And that sort of lost Midrash. When I was a rabbinical student, I remember there was this big project called the Melton Project. We were trying to say, well, let's change Jewish education and teach a biblical critical attitude in the Hebrew schools. Give them a sense of the historical context, and that will make it meaningful for them. And of course, it was a colossal failure. But I have seen in my lifetime, and this is partly a post-Holocaust event, it's partly also, I think, the new creativity generated by the existence of the State of Israel. I've seen in my lifetime the rebirth of Midrash. I see it in a range from Arthur Wasko's books, From God Wrestling On, to Ellen Frankel's 5 Books of Miriam, and Sharon and others, Sharon and Judith and others, sort of rebirth of feminist Midrash, to a whole lot of Midrashic creativity that's come out in Israel, literary works, rereading. I think we have seen in our age, and I think this has to do, even before we had the word postmodernity, some of that postmodern project was happening. People going back to the text and saying, no, I can read it freely. And I can engage in this, I can re-engage in this process of drash, and that does not require fundamentalist literalism. Because the old justification for Shivim Panim La Torah, of course, was because God gave it, and God said it, that it can have Shivim Panim, it can have infinite meaning. Shivim was a stand-in for lots and lots or infinite. It can have that because it's the divine word. And both Mordechai Kaplan and Gershom Scholem said in various times, well, that's dead now, that's gone. Since we are no longer literal believers in the revelation of the text, we therefore have to fall on our swords before Spinoza and say, all right, these are just human texts, you can't do that. And we have found the ability to say, no, this is sacred text for us, this is sacred canon. And therefore we do have the right and even the obligation to save it, transform it, uplift it, surprise ourselves with it by being midrashically creative with it. And that doesn't require fundamentalism, doesn't require a literal belief in divine revelation. Yes, of course we find sparks of divinity in the text. We do that all the time. That's what our work is about in some ways, finding that the text on some level, almost beyond articulation, is divine for us. But we do that partly through asserting the freedom to be midrashically creative with it. And that's terribly important. So this process, this midrashic process, is, I believe, again, the lifeblood of Judaism. And as rabbis, it's a process you should be engaged in. You should be engaged in this midrashic process. Your own drashot, in some ways, of course, are that, and your own creativity in relating to the text of the tradition is part of that. We are always, the purpose of Midrash is always to enrich the tradition, to pass it on richer than it was before, to add something to it. Of course, and knowing the tremendous riches that are there in Midrash of all generations of the past, is part of that. So the more you know, the more you are inspired to continue in that process. So it's not just taking the text and say, okay, what will I say about it? How will I use it for my own purposes? We have to be careful with that, because we have to let the text seduce us as we seduce it. The relationship between the darshan, between the Baal Midrash and the text, is a mutual relationship. You talk about contemporary myth, contemporary personal myth. I just immediately thought I don't think I shared this with you here, but I shared this somewhere recently. So if I did, I apologize for repeating it. In the years I worked on Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav and was writing Tormented Master, which was a very complicated process. I became Rabbi Nachman's biographer because I didn't want to be his disciple, but I wanted to be very close to him, and I found another way of relating, which was the relation of biographer and subject. But sometimes I understood what the Bratslavers mean when they say he never quite died, because I sometimes felt he was revealing himself to me. He was giving me an opportunity to understand something about himself, because I felt that he understood that as long as I was working on him, he would have a chance to work on me. And that relationship became a mutual relationship. And that's what our relationship with the text is like. It's a mutual relationship. Yes, you work on it, but it works on you. And you enter into this living dialogue with the text. That's what it means to be a Baal Midrash. And that's a statement about Nachman. That's a mythic statement. Yes, I don't mean it in a literal way. I don't mean in a literal way he was there as a conscious being still alive. Of course not. You understand that I'm speaking mythopoetically in doing that. But learning to do that, learning to speak that kind of language is much of what we're both talking about. And we have to be careful when we approach the rabbinic literature, when we approach the great treasure of rabbinic literature. We have to be aware, because this literature is often seen by us through filters that weren't originally natural to it. There are two filters I urge you to be careful of. One is the Maimonidean filter. We get Chazal as interpreted for us through the Rambam, and therefore Chazal were rational, legalistic kinds of people. They didn't have beliefs that were too mythical or too pagan-like, because after all they were rational people and they believed in a pure monotheism. And Maimonides has reread the rabbis for us, and much of later tradition, especially for us westernized post-Mendelssohnian Jews who revived Maimonides as a theology they thought they could save. We were shown the rabbis very much through that Maimonidean prism of a sort of rational legalism. And the other, which is a variant on it, is the Lithuanian prism, the Lithuanian yeshiva prism, which is to say, rabbinic Judaism is